Hey guys, my name is JC Dean. Today we're going to talk about the topic of weight gain, and I have a series of questions that came in from a guy named Dan. He's young, he's 18 years old, he started lifting recently, and he's wanting to know about how to gain weight, how to do it properly, and overcoming some of the mental issues he struggled with food ideas. And anyway, we're going to get into it. I've got my tablet here, I'm going to read his email to you, and then we're going to cover 5 particular things that I've pulled out to discuss in this video. Email reads, I'm an 18-year-old at 130 pounds, I'm 5'10", and I've been lifting for over a year, but I'm just getting into it seriously within the last couple of months. My question is in regards to calorie counting for bulking. I have quite a neurotic personality, and I've tried to track macros for some time since getting serious about bulking, but over time, it started to consume me to the point where it impacts my social life. Furthermore, I love to cook, and what I cook contains loads of different ingredients, and I rarely eat the same thing twice. This makes tracking very difficult. I thoroughly enjoy the process of bulking and want to keep doing it, but the way my social life is negatively impacted by tracking macros and calories simply makes it unsustainable. What would you recommend me do? And then he actually wrote me another email asking a further question on top of that, and it reads as, I have another question, however not on the topic of nutrition but regarding training, whether or not to strive for progressive overload on days I'm not feeling well in the gym. In other words, should I try to achieve progressive overload or simply match my last workout on the days the weights feel very heavy? So Dan is asking a lot in this email, and I'm going to tackle 5 specific things. Tracking macros for bulking or gaining weight. Is it necessary? What about the variety in your diet? Will it help or hinder you? How to stick with your diet without it impacting your social life. Daily versus weekly calorie needs. And progressive overload and what matters for the beginner trainee. So let's start with tracking macros for bulking and the whole idea of gaining weight. Is it a necessary evil? So a lot of people are going to tell you that you don't need to track your intake, and then there are going to be people like me who's going to say you do need to track your intake. The reality of the matter is either way works. Some people are going to be able just to eat more and gain weight, but in Dan's situation, it's definitely not working for him. So what I typically recommend to someone who is light in body weight, wanting to put on 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 plus pounds, who's not been able to do so, is to consistently track your intake. And the reason for this is because if you're not tracking, and you're not tracking consistently, it's easy to fall back into the habits and patterns that are keeping you skinny. For instance, if your habitual intake, meaning what you eat on a consistent basis, is 2 to 3 meals per day, and you're only hitting a certain caloric amount, so let's say an average of anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 calories, that average doesn't matter, but what the point I'm making is if you hit a certain point, and that's maintaining your body weight, and you're never consciously eating more than that, you're not going to gain weight. So where Dan is falling into an issue is he's trying to eat to gain more, but he's not tracking his intake. And he's not tracking his intake because he feels like every little thing that he puts into a recipe is not doable. We'll get to the variety in the diet in a second, but here's what you need to know. If you're having a hard time gaining weight, yes, you probably need to track, and you'll need to establish your baseline, which is what we call your maintenance intake, however much it takes to maintain your weight. And once you understand that, you just need to track how much you eat and then aim to eat above and beyond. I typically like to recommend 10 to 20% for a baseline. So if your maintenance intake for a young 18-year-old guy who's moving around a lot in training is 2,500 calories, I would take 2,500, multiply that by 20%, and add that on. And I typically like to add it in the form of carbohydrate, especially if you're already getting enough fat in your diet and enough protein, which is about 1 gram per pound of body weight. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the variety in the diet. And Dan mentioned in the email that he's very neurotic about tracking and counting, and he also said that he doesn't really eat the same thing twice. He tends to eat a lot of different foods. He has a ton of variety, and he's making all these different concoctions in the kitchen, has a bunch of recipes, and so he's finding it really hard to add every single ingredient. So here's my solution to this. I understand it may be a little boring to eat similar foods all the time, but if it's causing you that much of an issue mentally, and it's keeping you from actually hitting your goals and gaining weight and getting bigger and stronger, then you need to make a compromise. Maybe you don't need to eat a new dish every meal every single day, one thing I like to do is keep my breakfast and my lunch the same. And then what I'll do 2 or 3 nights a week, I'll have something different for my dinner. So instead of having a beef dish, I'll have a fish dish. Or instead of fish, I'll have chicken. Or sometimes I'll have lamb. Or sometimes I'll have something completely different, maybe a soup, or maybe grill something, whatever. I make the changes for my dinner, but I make sure that my breakfast and my lunch are the same. That way, I don't have to worry about tracking a bunch of different ingredients for every single meal. If I want some variety in my diet, I can have it during dinner. And then even some weeks go by where I eat the same thing for every single meal. Now, I'm not saying that's the most optimal thing to do, but if it helps you stay on track and it helps you eat enough food to get bigger and stronger like you want to, then it is probably necessary to be more of what we call a uniform eater, someone who eats the same things on a consistent basis, instead of trying to be a gourmet chef and having a bunch of different ingredients for every single meal of the day and losing your mind trying to track it all. The next thing Dan wanted to talk about is how to stick with your diet without it impacting your social life. This actually ties into my last point about variety in the diet and trying to keep things as simple as possible. When you're in social situations, there's not a ton you can do about tracking your intake. Most of us, we equate social activities to things that we do in the evening. So if you're gonna go out and you're gonna have some food with your friends, or you're gonna go out and drink beer, or you're gonna go out to a late movie and then have dinner afterwards, whatever you do, you know that you can't really control that meal. But what you can do is you can control your breakfast, your lunch, and probably your pre and post workout, however you decide to have those meals. So the best part about that is if you're already controlling those meals, you can aim to hit a certain amount of food by the time you go out to that social event. So if you know that you need to be in a surplus, you know that you need to hit a certain caloric mark by the end of the day, make sure that you get enough food during breakfast, enough food during lunch. Make sure you track that stuff and ensure that you've notated everything and you know that you got a certain amount. So when you go out and you go to dinner or whatever you end up doing, you make the food choices that you know are going to put you at about your maintenance level or a little bit over. And that's the whole point of it. You're not going to know 100% whether or not your burger was 300 calories or 1,300 calories. You're not going to know that. But when you're eating out, you tend to know that the serving sizes, especially if you're in America, the serving sizes are pretty large. Eating out can be as small as 500 calories or up to 2,500 calories, depending on what you choose. So I just recommend that you try to make a sensible choice, get enough protein, get enough carbohydrates, and just enjoy the food in the social setting. And that's what I try to do. I try to hit my mark all the way up until the social outing. And if I know that I need to eat some more food in order to be in a caloric surplus, I make the choice and I have something tasty, something that I want with my friends, and I don't worry about it too much because at the end of the day, it's just one night of going out and having some food with your friends. You don't need to worry about it so much, and you're gonna worry less if you really focus on hitting your food targets early in the day. So another thing that Dan was talking about, we're gonna cover here is caloric surplus. Are we looking more at a daily surplus or are we looking more at a weekly surplus? For most beginners, I like to keep it incredibly simple. Giving someone the task of training frequently 3 or 4 times a week and making sure that they're doing that correctly and giving them a really complicated diet of having high and low days is typically not the best approach because there's so much stuff that they need to get right. So I really like to make sure that most of their attention is on their training, make sure their training is good, it's going well, they're getting enough sleep, they're recovering, and they're making progress. And then I want to make the diet as easy as possible. For beginners, I typically tell them, I want you to hit a surplus on a daily basis. Now, this can be a smaller surplus of 100 to 200 calories. It can be upwards of 500 to 1,000, depending upon the person, because some people are going to have higher demands and bigger needs than the other person. And typically for beginners, the more you can get them to eat on a daily basis is typically better because it builds a better habit of getting them in the routine of eating more consistently. You can hypothesize all day long about a weekly surplus being better than having a daily surplus or having 3 high-calorie days and 4 low-calorie days. You can hypothesize all you want, but if your main goal is to get bigger and stronger and you're 130 pounds and 5'10", 18-year-old kid, you really need to focus on eating enough frequently enough. And if you don't do that, you're never going to realize your goals. You're never going to get bigger. You're never going to get stronger like you want to. And you're just going to be frustrated at the end of 12 or 16 weeks when you look in the mirror and you realize you don't weigh anymore and you don't look any different. And for point number 5, we're going to talk about the idea of progressive overload for the beginner. What should your training look like and what should you focus on? Specifically, Dan asked about when he goes into the gym and he doesn't feel as good as he did the last time. Should he try to push the weight? Should he just maintain and do what he did the last session? Basically, the typical questions you're going to have for someone who's constantly trying to make improvements every time they go into the gym. So the number one thing I'm always going to tell all beginners, because you can't have someone focus on too many things at once, is focus on the long-term progression and just get stronger. Now, I don't mean that you need to become the strongest in terms of a 1 rep max. I personally don't care if you squat 300 pounds or 500 pounds for 1 rep. I'm more interested in what you can do in volume over time. Sure, it's impressive to have a 500 pound deadlift or a 400 pound deadlift, but it's even more impressive if you can do 400 pounds for 3 sets of 10. Now, if you can do 400 pounds for 3 sets of 10 on a deadlift, you're going to be way further along in your physique gains than you are if you can just do 1 rep for 400 pounds. So the gist of this is yes, you need to make strength gains over time. Does it mean you need to make all of them in the next 12 weeks? No, because you want to pace yourself. What I typically want my beginner trainees to do is get stronger incrementally. Go into the session expecting to have an increase on whatever movement you're doing. But if you can't add 5 pounds to your squat, do what you did last week. Do what you did last session. It doesn't really matter. I would rather you get the quality reps in and get the volume in as opposed to trying to get stronger every single session. Now, if you look back over 12 weeks and you haven't made any strength gains and you've regressed, something is obviously wrong with the programming, because a beginner is going to be able to make many more strength gains much more quickly than someone like myself who's been training for 13, 14 years. I really want you to get control over contraction quality, because what I'm aiming at here is I want you using your muscles. I don't want you creating better leverages. I don't want you bouncing the weight off your chest. I don't want you slinging the weight up to your stomach when you're doing rows. I don't want you doing quarter squats, that type of thing. Really focus on using good form, going through the full range of motion, and really pay attention to your muscles firing. The bodybuilders from the 70s would say focus on the mind-muscle connection, and I'm a huge believer in that. Just don't get so caught up in the idea that you have to create a pump if it means that you are spending too much time on one exercise or spending too much time focusing on one body part when you're not really focusing on progressive overload. So, to recap that, make sure you're getting stronger over time. Try to add a little weight every session if possible. And then also focus equally on getting a good quality contraction in the muscle. Make sure when you're doing your bench press, feel it in your chest. When you're doing your shoulder presses, feel it in your shoulders. Make sure you're paying attention to those muscles working. Don't just do the work to put in the reps and not pay attention to what's actually happening. And there we have it. So Dan, I hope that helps. Keep training hard, make sure you eat well, put these ideas into practice. My name is JC Dean. See you next time.